And welcome to this week's edition of the Reigns on the Cardinals podcast. Rob Reigns, Mike Reigns, STL Sports Page here as we break down the Cardinals of this week out in Arizona and then California. And unfortunately, Mike, we also have to talk about the death of a good friend of ours, a good friend of the Cardinal family, Whitey Herzog, earlier this week. So we'll get to reactions and some stories and memories of Whitey here later on in the podcast. How are you this fine day?
Doing good. You know, this Cardinal team is exciting to watch at times and frustrating to watch at times.
Yeah, they're kind of offense kind of stuck in a rut. You can roll a three every day, and just sometimes it's enough, sometimes it's not. It's 10. Cardinals, of course, lose on Wednesday in Oakland, the finale of that series. Now 0-6 in the series from now. As you know, remember a year ago, they couldn't win the first game of the series. I think they started the year 0-13 in the first game of the series. Now this year it's flipped. It's the last game of a series that they can't win. How do you explain that?
But at the end of the day, if you're winning 2 out of 3 in the series, I would take that all day long. If you win the first 2 and lose the last one, you win 2/3 of your games, you're doing just fine.
Well, that'd be fine, yeah. So, but anyway, 10 out of the last 11 games now that the Cardinals have scored 3 runs or less, including 3 in all 3 games in Oakland. 2 of those games, there was enough, 3 runs was enough to win, thanks to Sonny Gray and Lance Lynn's pitching in those 2 games. But, actually, when look at it, the Cardinals have won 4 of those 11 games in which they've only 4 of the 10 games in which they've scored 3 runs or less in the last 11 game stretch. And I would argue that that's pretty good. I think, I know you and I both, think it would have been different a year ago.
Yes, absolutely. The starting pitching this year in the bullpen has been fantastic, right? And so last year you were giving up 5 and 6 runs. So when you're scoring 3, that's not enough. This year, you look at the first 2 starts out of Sonny Gray, and man, he's looked fantastic. You look at both the new additions of Gibson and Lynn, and they've both looked really good too. And so the pitching and the defense has kept them in a lot of games this year that they were losing last year.
And if they do get a lead late, Ryan Helsley's been a lockdown reliever. He's already got 7 saves, 7 of the 9 wins the Cardinals have. He's got the save. The last 4 times out, he's retired everybody you face. He's got 12 in a row batters that he's retired in his last 4 saves. So, I think you can look at a lot of positives there if they could get the offense going. But I think that's the big 2-letter word. Before we get any farther, I want to thank all of our sponsors for making our Reigns on the Cardinals podcast free and available to everybody here on STL Sports Page. Just it's like all of our Cardinal content. No paywalls here. You can get all of your stories for free. Of course, all of our coverage of Whitey Herzog's passing and everything else. So our thanks to the Rawlings Experience, Archwell Health, AAA Travel of Missouri, and of course our main title sponsor has been with us a long time, the Drury Hotels chain. So I would obviously encourage you to visit all of those fine companies. You can learn more about them here on the website. If you haven't been out to the Rawlings Experience yet in Westport, the grand opening last week, we were lucky enough to be out there for that. It's just phenomenal. I think everybody that we've talked to who's been out there has just raved about what a great job they did and how neat it is. Now it needs to be on your list of go-to places here in the St. Louis area, whether you're coming in for a ball game from out of town or you live in St. Louis, just get out to Westport, plan a day, have lunch, and go see that Rawlings Experience. I don't think you'll be disappointed.
It's a must-see attraction for sure. It's really cool. Part store, part museum. It got a little bit of everything in there.
Maybe we can send some of the Cardinal players out there to go through their hitting lab and see if we can figure out what's wrong with their bats.
Yeah, that might be helpful, right? I mean, the offense really has been struggling. And, the guy we've talked about a long time is Paul Goldschmidt. No extra base hits since opening day.
I think it's 62 at bats now since then. I mean, and I don't how do you explain that? I mean, you and I talked about it just personally, off the camera, off the telephone, and just I think he's one of those guys that you have to stay with him because of his track record and what he's done. And I don't know what your options would be. And I think that's part of the Cardinal problem right now. Not just Goldschmidt, you can add the other guys into that group too. I don't think they've got a lot of other choices about who to play. I mean, their lineup is pretty much set. It's the lineup we thought it was going to be. And I know you don't have Edmund. I know you don't have Carlson, which are guys that could help you, but they're not coming back anytime soon. So I think you're kind of stuck with who you got, and you just have to hope that they can turn it around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest challenge too is what do you do with a guy like Goldie, right? You can't really drop him in the lineup. You can't really move him around because you think and you hope that the MVP caliber player of him is still there, but is he getting older quicker than we thought he would, or is it just a month slump that people get into? And typically he's a second half type player, but you really hope that soon he figures it out.
Because I think the power drain is what's killing this team. They found a way to manufacture some runs. So, the speed game has been a little bit better, even though it hasn't been as good as you thought it would be, because Victor Scott II hasn't been able to take advantage of his speed by not getting on base with enough hits and enough walks that he could steal some bases. But you got Mason Wynn has played well. I think Wilson Contreras has played well. And I think Ivan Herrera has probably surprised people with how well he has played. But that's about the only three positives about this offense that I could say.
Yeah, and I think Mason Wynn has got to be the most exciting part and the most praised so far this season, right? Because he's been off to a fantastic start and playing really well, and hopefully the other guys can match him there. But it's interesting when I was looking at the stat earlier about the runs scored overall for the Cardinals this season, and they ranked tied for second in fewest runs scored this year. However, the difference is they rank fourth from the top in runs allowed, with a run differential of only -9. So it's really not that bad when you look at it, which is why they're able to win a few more of the games that they weren't winning last year, because the defense and the pitching is allowing them to not give up as many.
And the crazy thing is, what you and I we've talked about, well before this season started, with this crazy schedule that the Cardinals had in April, the tough schedule, the fact that they played more games in California so far than they played at home, just being one of the oddities to the season so far. We said if they could get through April with a 500 record, we would take that. Well, they're a game under, 9-10, going into the home opener Friday night against Milwaukee. But I think the thing is, how they got to those 9 wins is what's been the surprising part.
Absolutely. And we said from the beginning, too, that, the standings in April really don't matter a whole lot. But being one game under 500, the Braves only have 12 wins, and they're at the top. So you're really not playing yourself out of anything yet, with as bad as the offense has been. So if the offense can come around a little bit to highlight the pitching and the defense, this team could make some ground here pretty quickly.
Here's the thing that concerns me a little bit. I wanted to put the last one so I can actually make sure I get the numbers right. They have 4 players that are primarily been, so it's half, basically 4 out of the 9 players who are in the lineup consistently on a regular basis who have more strikeouts than hits so far this season. So the first one, of course, is Goldschmidt, 22 strikeouts, 12 hits. Then you got Gorman, who's got 26 strikeouts, 13 hits. Victor Scott II, 5 hits, 14 strikeouts. Jordan Walker, 9 hits, 15 strikeouts. And none of those guys, unfortunately, are hitting for power either. You've got, and I should have mentioned when I said the positives, I think Arenado also is a little bit of a positive too, because he started out slowly, but he's at least getting some hits here and coming along. Had a pretty good road trip as far as getting some hits. Only 1 home run to this point, and that's part of the other problem. Cardinals have been out homered 23-13, 13 home runs, down near the bottom of the team's home run rankings around baseball. And here's the other problem with the 13 home runs. Only 1 of those, no grand slams, 1 3-run homer, 5 2-run homers, 7 of them solo homers. So even when they hit a home run, they're not driving in many runs.
You think Nolan was frustrated that ball he hit in Oakland wasn't a home run?
What how they always do that percentage, if that ball would have been a home run in how many ballparks? Would it have been every other ballpark except Oakland?
But on the flip side, Lynn probably would have given up a couple there too that might have been out.
So, question. I think those things generally work themselves out, balance out.
I think that's the positive, right? But I think the other challenge to this team is they haven't been home. And
right.
So, they've been on the road a lot and struggling. And to be, they typically say you want to play 500 ball on the road, right? Well, that's kind of where they've been. So hopefully if they can come home here and settle down and get some good night's sleep in their own bed, off day to day can help. And, just kind of reset being at home can hopefully help recharge some of this team.
Right. I think there's no question. They've got to get Goldschmidt going. They've got to get Jordan Walker going. I mean, he's a guy that I think you were counting on being a big boost. You thought positive things from him, especially the second half of last season. He played much better than he did early on. He's looked much more comfortable in right field, has made some really nice plays in right field, I think, this year. But now it's the offense that we're worried about. And when you take Brendan Donovan out of the equation, you really have gotten basically no offense out of any of your outfielders.
And what's interesting, too, is this team's not walking a whole lot, which tells me they're not seeing the ball well at the plate, right? Outside of Donovan and Wynn, is anybody really taking a lot of walks? Not really. Nothing stands out. And so that tells you when you look at somebody like Goldie, because Goldie takes a fair amount of walks too, because he doesn't chase pitches when he's right. And right now he's chasing low and away. And you can tell that he's not right because he's not swinging at pitches in the zone. He's swinging out of the zone. And so I think that's the difference too, is when you start to see guys walk more is when you'll start to realize that they're seeing the ball better.
But as I say, I think you have to pretty much ride with these same guys because I don't know what you're. I mean, you've got some other bench guys, but Crawford has played it a little bit, but he would only play in place of win, and he's been arguably your best player. You're finding a way to get Contreras and Herrera both in the lineup, either as a DH or catching. You know, beyond that, Carpenter's still out, so he's not going to replace Goldschmidt. So I think you're just going to have to ride these guys and just hope they get it turned around.
And I think what's tough is like in the money that you're paying and the anchor that you're wanting Goldie and Arenado to be, you have to let them just work the slump out, right? And hopefully it gets out quicker than we all want.
It's really a pretty simple equation. If they don't get it done, the way this team is constructed, if they don't hit their way out of the slumps, it's just you don't have to worry about anything else because this club's not going to go anywhere.
Unless the pitching and the bullpen continues to be as well as they've been, right? I think that's one of the highlights of this year is how well the bullpen's pitched, and they've really done a nice job. And Helsley's been locked down at the back end of that bullpen, and so that's helpful when you're not scoring many runs. You're not giving up many either. So this team needs to find a way to score a few more runs. But if the pitching can stay like it's been, I'm not as concerned. But yes, the offense needs to wake up.
We should have mentioned if people are wondering about your background and where all the stuff on your wall went. You're in the process of moving, so that's why the wall might be a little bit bare behind you. But still taking time to join us today on the podcast, so we appreciate that.
The moving truck will be here Saturday, so we'll welcome any and all help that wants to help us move.
Staying in town, though. Don't panic, everybody. Mike is not leaving St. Louis, not leaving the podcast, so we'll be able to talk to him again next week. Of course, the other big story, other than the Cardinals offense and struggling along in that department this week, was unfortunate the death of Whitey Herzog. You called me Tuesday morning to break that news to me when you had seen it on social media, and just and I mentioned on a radio interview actually in Springfield earlier that when somebody is 92 years old, I guess we're kind of prepared for something to happen because it's just the nature of life, but it still kind of came as a surprise and a shock and a very, very sad day and a very sad moment because we were, you knew him as well as I did. We were around him when our family was around him, when you and your brother were growing up. And he's just a guy that we're going to remember for a long time as not only from a professional standpoint, what a great manager he was, but just what a nice guy he was.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was someone that if you've been around the city of St. Louis for a long time, he was someone that you saw around frequently, right? He was very involved in the community and very involved in supporting St. Louis. And he was someone that was always there. And it was nice to see him at opening day this year. And, he looked good. So I think that's why it kind of came to a shock to all of us because we saw him there and thought he looked pretty good. And definitely a sad day for those around the Cardinal organization and around St. Louis in general.
Yeah, he wasn't able to participate in the parade going around the stadium in the cars, but he was in the seats and they introduced him. He waved to the crowd just 12 days before, unfortunately, took a turn for the worse. He'd had some health struggles over the last few months, but didn't really expect anything, serious like this to happen. So funeral arrangements we don't understand are still being made. There'll be a private service. I think the club is planning on doing some stuff later on once they get everything figured out. But there'll certainly be a lot of ways to honor Whitey, I'm sure, as we go forward. One of the things that happened after there's a picture we're showing now is, luckily you were able to be around Whitey a little bit as you were a kid growing up in the 80s. And he was very nice to everybody in our family. Made an appearance at a surprise birthday party that we had. He and Sam Musial, Charles Drury, Lee Thomas, Gene Gieselman, there were a lot of great people at that party. So that was a lot of fun. I know that's a memory I will have for a long time.
One of the things about Whitey too is that nobody else was ever above him and he was never above them. He would always talk to anybody about anything and didn't care whether, where you were on the status quo, so to speak. And, he was just always a friendly guy, always up for a talk to anybody. It didn't matter. He just wanted to get to know you and say hi and see what you know.
He loved to tell stories. He loved to talk baseball. And if you could if you ask interesting questions, he would entertain you for hours. I know I had a chance to talk to Rick Horton after we heard the news. And what Rick talked about mostly was how much he enjoyed Whitey being at the fantasy camps all those years and being able to just sit around and hold court and people asking questions and he'd answer questions. And, people have asked me, over the last couple of days, obviously my relationship with Whitey went back to 1978 when I first met him when we were in Kansas City together. I beat him to St. Louis by 6 months, but what I like most about him, and I think it was just listening to his stories, listening to him being able to talk baseball. When Rick Hummel and I were the two beat writers in the '80s, I was working at the Globe Democrat, Rick was working at the Post Dispatch. We were around Whitey all the time, and there was just not the level of media interest, or I don't want to say interest, but coverage of the team. It was pretty much the two newspapers and KMOX Radio, and Channel 5 at the time was doing the Cardinal TV broadcast. So that was about it on a regular basis. Maybe a few other radio people around on the home games, but especially on the traveling corps, it was a lot smaller group, and so you had more time to get to know the players and Whitey, and you spent more time in his office. You had much better access. They didn't control the access like they do now. So, and Whitey liked the reporters. He liked talking baseball. He liked sitting around, asking us questions, what we thought, and it was just a great dialogue. And as I talked to a lot of the guys on those teams in the '80s the other day, we all kind of reflected on that and what we're going to miss about it.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that I've heard from you over the years too is that how, obviously back then there wasn't the coverage because there wasn't social media and there wasn't, so many, internet bloggers and things writing about the game and stuff like that. And, other people, more newspapers and stuff now and the Athletic and everything else. But you would always say how, Rick and I knew what we could write and what we couldn't write. And Whitey would just sit there and talk to us, and we'd get a lot more honest conversation because he knew what we were going to leave out and what we were going to put in the story.
Yeah, you could kind of tell when he was saying something because he wanted it in the newspaper, and when he was just kind of venting a little bit. The one thing I would say about Whitey, and I hope everybody had a chance to read our story that is on the STLSportsPage.com. It's a long story. Talked to a lot of different people with their memories and their stories about Whitey. But the one thing I'll say about him is the one people say, could he have managed today in the game today? And I think he could have managed just as well in any era because he would have adapted. He would have changed with the times. He would have known, what to do and the moves to make. And he was always, a move or two ahead of every other manager. But the one thing that I think he would have struggled with in today's game was having his post-game press conferences on television, because that would not have been a good experience. he didn't mince too many words usually, but when we was just talking to newspaper guys, he didn't have to worry about it showing up in the newspaper or have somebody watching it on television.
You might have to have a censor button pretty close for some of his speech, that's for sure.
Depending on what kind of mood he was in. Yeah, he was.
The thing about Whitey's ability too, I mean, you got to think about how he changed the game and how the game changed with him, because like the Cardinals of the 60s were great and they were winning a lot and always in the World Series. Cardinals of the 70s were not good. They were kind of very dull and bad. And when he came in the 80s, the game started to change. It was played on AstroTurf at that point in time, and speed and bunting became a big thing. And, he changed with the game and adapted it to where it was. So to say, could Whitey manage today? I think he absolutely could, because he wasn't stuck in his ways. He was willing to change as the game changed.
I remember there was a team a few years ago. It's been a few years ago now, but after he'd been out of the game for a while, one of the clubs called and asked if he would think about becoming a manager, and he said, "Well, yeah, I only have one condition: you'd have to play all your games at 10 a.m. because that's the only time I guarantee I'm awake." So that was. But the thing about Whitey too, I'll say two things that stand out to me when you think about his legacy in St. Louis. The first thing he did when he got to St. Louis was he realized that he couldn't win with the team the way it was constructed, and they were not a good team fundamentally. They were not a good team. They were not built for that ballpark. So what he did by going out and getting trading for Willie McGee, trading for Ozzie Smith, the team drafted Vince Coleman and brought him along. What he did was he changed the makeup of that club and took advantage of the ballpark and the dimensions and the AstroTurf to realize that he could win games by stealing bases and playing great defense and getting good pitching. I still think you could win games that way today, but everybody tries to outslug everybody. Nobody cares if a guy strikes out 200 times in a season. They're always just trying to hit 30 or 40 home runs. So that style of baseball was exciting and it was great, and I think everybody loved it. And I think that was the second point of this, is that there were so many people that you talked to, so many comments that you saw on social media after they heard about Whitey, passing away on Tuesday, was that he made them baseball fans. When they grew up in that era, they fell in love with the Cardinals. They fell in love with baseball because of the way that team played, and obviously the success that the team had that way. And they're still fans to this day. And Whitey talked about how that team set attendance records year after year after year. And that was one of the things he was most proud of, was how the fans responded to the team and to that style of play.
The team was fun to watch, right? I mean, that was the thing. They may not have been generating a ton of offense, but they made great plays. They pitched well, and they stole bases and still generated offense. So the team was fun to watch, the question that I wonder is, in the state of Missouri, Whitey is loved, right, with the Royals and with the Cardinals both. But if he could have found a way to win in 78 and win in 85, win those last 2 World Series, and all of a sudden have 3 titles under his belt, would he be remembered differently outside of Missouri?
Probably, yeah. I mean, that they look at how many World Series championships this you won, and they're 1 game away from winning 2 of them in '85 and '87 here, and they're close. They got lost in the playoffs in when he was in Kansas City with their best team in '78 to the Yankees. But yeah, it's just and we've seen it in recent years too. Once you get into the postseason, pretty much anything could happen. And don't forget, back then, there were fewer divisions. There was no wild card era, so you had to win your division to get in the playoffs. So how many times have we seen a wild card team get hot in October and win the World Series? But you couldn't do that back then. I mean, the best 2 teams usually played in the World Series for a reason. And luckily he did get in the Hall of Fame. It took him probably a little bit longer than it should have. Went in 2010, but he's there forever and should be, because no question in my mind, in this era of the time that I've been covering baseball, the best manager I ever saw.
Yeah, and I think the thing is too, there's not anyone that could say anything bad about him, right? You've never met it. I mean, have you ever heard anyone say anything bad about Whitey or his game or his style that he played? Or no, everybody loved it. It was fun to watch, and they loved how he didn't censor himself. Kind of, he was going to tell you how he felt and what he thought, and he didn't care who he offended. And there's something to be said about being blunt and upfront and honest about it, right?
He grew up in New Athens, Illinois, and never really left. I mean, he obviously lived in St. Louis, but I mean, he was still, the same guy that he was back then. He never forgot where he came from. He was a hardworking guy. He, worked off-season jobs in the era when he played. People forget he played 8-9 years in the big leagues too. He wasn't a great player. One of the best lines he said was, "Baseball has been very good to me ever since I stopped trying to play it." But he worked for the Mets for a long time. Had a lot of different jobs as far as a coach, as far as director of player development. As I say, just just a wizard as far as identifying who could play and who couldn't play. Didn't need a computer to do it. And he also, I think, was ahead of his time in terms of statistics and analytics, even though before they called it that. Because I remember day after day after day sitting in his office before the game. He had his colored pencils out and his notebooks, and he kept charts of every pitch that was thrown in that game and where it was hit off of different pitchers. Each pitcher had a different color. Part of the fun part was figuring out which pitcher was going to be which color, for that season. And I think he was, he looked at those charts and referred to those charts. And when he came to deciding how to make moves, how to position the defense, nobody ever than him better at handling a bullpen. And just a lot of fond memories, and he will definitely be missed. And again, hope you get a chance to check out the story, because a lot of the guys had a lot of great things to say about him. So Cardinals have the day off on Thursday. Friday, the Milwaukee Brewers come to town to start a 3-game weekend series. And Mike, as we mentioned, one of the oddities of the schedule, first games against the NL Central opponent. And here we are, 3 weeks into the season.
And it's a battle of the Wilson brothers, or the Contreras brothers, I should say. But
yeah,
it'll be interesting
Wilson
to see.
But
division games, so will be very important games against Milwaukee.
Of course, the division kind of thing is you can always get all of my post-game reports after every game here on the website as well. But the thing about the division race too, though, and we talked about this a year ago, by changing the schedule and going to the balanced schedule, you reduce the number of games within the division. So those division games, head-to-head games, are still very important when it comes to winning that division. But I don't think they're as important as they used to be, because you had so much heavier concentration of games within the division than you do now.
Well, I think what's different is if you want to win the division games matter. They don't matter as much for the wild card aspect of it, right? I think they matter more for the division because there's less opportunity to make ground in your division against them.
Correct. And these are the only 3 games, NL Central games, the Cardinals play until May 9th when they go to Milwaukee for a 4-game series. So they don't play another NL Central opponent until May 24th, which is really kind of a bizarre schedule. And they don't play the Cubs in September at all. So the schedule is just goofy this year. So Kyle Gibson will get the start on Friday night. Sonny Gray pitches on Sunday. Obviously going to look to see if he can keep his streak going. Hasn't allowed a run yet, now in 11 innings in his first 2 starts.
He's looked great. He really has looked fantastic, and is in control out there, and really his pitch count has been great. He hasn't been working too hard in innings or going too deep, and it's exciting to watch and have him back healthy.
So we'll be back with another edition of Brains of the Cardinals podcast here next week. Our thanks again to Drury Hotels, Archwell Health, the Rawlings Experience. Get out there at Westport if you haven't done it yet. AAA Travel of Missouri for bringing this podcast to you every week, as well as all the other content here on STLSportsPage.com. Mike, thank you. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks.